Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at Israel's K98k snipers. These are not quite the very first sniper rifles that the Israeli Defense Forces had, but they're the first ones that were actually purpose assembled in Israel. So the first sniper rifles that the IDF got were actually part of the initial supply of arms to the Haganah in the 1948 war. So the Israelis were able to purchase a bunch of equipment from Czechoslovakia, which included, in small arms, a lot of surplus German material, as well as late war Czech-made German pattern material. Included a lot of Kar-98k Mausers, and some of those were actually original World War II snipers. In their sniper configuration, those were used fairly extensively and fairly effectively during Israel's independence war in 1948. So they stick around, they're well liked, they're accurate, they're reliable, etc. Israel in the late 1950s decides to rechamber or re-standardize its military small arms to the 7.62 NATO cartridge, and between 1955 and 1960 they go out rebarreling all of their K98Ks to 7.62 NATO, or 308. And those rifles are actually relatively available on the US surplus market. A bunch of them have been imported, and you may recognize them by the big stamps burned into the stocks marked 7.62. And a bunch of them have Israeli crest barrels. They purchased new barrels from FN for this conversion and spent several years doing the conversion process. Well, in the course of doing this conversion, they hand-selected out the most accurate new 7.62 barreled rifles to earmark them for sniper work, for sniper assembly, and building them into what we have here. Now, this is at a time when Israel is able to buy arms from some countries, like Belgium, but they're still under essentially international embargo from others. So Germany, Austria, Switzerland, some of the countries best known for making optical sights, telescopes, are still prohibited from selling arms directly to Israel. So the IDF clearly has to sort of pick and choose and find the best of a bunch of suboptimal options for the actual sniper scopes to use on these rifles. And what they end up going with is a scope from a Swiss company called Wild, a 4x30 power scope with a weird set of mounts that they have to work around. So let's take a closer look. Let me show you what they did to make the mounts on these rifles, which are pretty odd mounts, and the other modifications that they made to the guns. All right, let's start with the scope here. Distinctive OD green in color, a few Israeli markings on them that were added there. Israeli IDF proof mark on it. This is a 4x30 power, and it's a weird kind of scope. If you look at this from the top, it is slightly offset to the left, not enough to really give you useful access. You can't use a stripper clip guide here. You can't reload via stripper clip because the scope's not offset enough, but it is offset enough that you can't zero this rifle and calculate windage at range as if it was center mounted. So a goofy setup here. And then the mounting system is also quite odd. And I believe what's going on here is that this was the scope that the Israelis were able to get their hands on, and so they kind of just had to make do with its odd characteristics, which included fabricating their own mounts because the scopes came with these mounting brackets built in, and the Israelis didn't have any sort of commercial bracket to fit them. So to remove this, I push this plunger here backwards. So we push this back, you can then lift the front of the scope up, and then the back of the scope comes off. So kind of typical looking claw mounts on the scope, but the Israelis didn't have a system that they could go out and buy to mount them, so they had to come up with their own. And frankly, this seems to me to be the sort of QD mounting system that an engineer would come up with who maybe wasn't really a shooter, because it seems good, it seems very secure. However, when you fire under recoil, of course, the rifle tends to go forward. This tends to compress like that, which potentially allows your scope to bounce loose and then retighten itself with each shot, which is not a fantastic setup. In fact, I've seen reference to at least one of these where they just gave up on the QD option entirely and spot welded the mounting claw to the mounting bracket to get rid of that being a problem. So yeah, a very distinctive set of mounts on these rifles. Now let's look at a couple other elements here. The serial number has been somewhat crudely restamped on the side of the barrel, and this is a new Israeli serial number. The Israeli snipers are all in the 200,000 series, and then that 3-digit number is actually the serial number. We do have that number repeated on the scope, and originally these would have been matching. Now, the best information I have is that 200 of these Swiss, they're Wild Heerbrug scopes, 200 of them were initially purchased. They couldn't be contracted directly through Switzerland, so they were purchased by a private dealer who then resold them into Israel, sort of cloak and dagger style of transaction. No idea, like I can't explain why the serial numbers are in this particular range. I presume there's some data that I just don't have that explains it. The scope does have a BDC cam that goes out to 1,000 meters, which is pretty impressive. Longer, that's a longer range than you would actually be able to really use with just 4-power magnification. So because the scope extends backwards here over the original safety, which was relatively small on the K98k, the Israelis basically just went and copied a World War II German modification to the gun. The Germans made entirely new safety levers that were longer. The Israelis made it a little bit simpler. They just cut down the original safety and welded on an extended key tab like that, which allows you to use this for some leverage and use the safety even when there's a scope on top of it. These scopes are also relatively high mounted because of the complexity of this QD bracket, and that led to them adding cheek rests to the stocks here, as well as extending the length of pull of the stock and adding a rubber butt plate to it. This is, again, very distinctive looking, kind of clunky, but this gives you an elevated cheek rest, which you need to effectively use this high-mounted scope. Just a couple other things to point out here. This was actually an FN production rifle, not an older surplus German one, and you know that because you can see the Belgian proof marks here on the receiver. The rear sight is a new 7.62 NATO calibrated rear sight. We actually have another example here that has an Israeli marked barrel with a 1958 date on it. They also went ahead and renumbered the bolt with the last 3 digits of that serial number. Sling swivels were added. They've been removed on this particular example, but they added a big sling swivel right to the bottom of the stock on the front, as well as one on the back. Of course, you still have the original German style slot, and there is a through hole here that can also be used for a sling attachment. I've seen that used with essentially paracord looping up to a big, wide, heavy sling. As is typical for sniper rifles, you were not expected to carry the gun with the scope mounted at all times. When it wasn't in use, you would carry the scope separately in a scope case. So of course, they made scope cases for them. We have the one here. This would have originally fitted the scope right there, along with a big rubber eye cup. This would have been the instruction booklet, and I'm not sure exactly what would have gone under there, but that's the scope case. Now, later on in their service life, and we'll talk about this in a moment, these rifles were retrofitted with more modern scopes, and the one you'll typically see is the Nimrod. This is a Japanese manufactured scope that was imported into Israel by an Israeli company. I think there was actually some Israeli ownership of the manufacturing company in Japan, which explains why they chose this particular brand. But there were both 6-power and 10-power Nimrod scopes that were purchased in the mid-1980s, primarily to be used on later pattern sniper rifles. However, the K98Ks, after they passed out of IDF Army duty, were handed down and continued to be used by essentially civil defense, territorial defense sorts of units. And those guys recognized that First off, they didn't have that many of the Wild scopes, and the Nimrods were much better, so they manufactured mounts like this that allow you to put a traditional, typical ring-mounted scope onto the K98k quick detach system. So you'll see these today often with more modern scopes like this 6-power Nimrod. These 7.62 K98k snipers in IDF service were really quite well liked. They were seen as being reliable, rugged, durable, accurate, pretty much everything you would want in a good sniper rifle. They also had a really good institutional memory from the 48 war, where the guns had served well and, again, exhibited all of these good characteristics. However, things would start to change with the 1967 Six-Day War. The Israelis had to, went up against Egypt, among, well, like everyone else in the region. In particular, Egyptian snipers along the Nile River had Dragunov rifles that they used to quite good effect sniping Israeli soldiers on the other side of the river. And the Israelis took some lessons from that, and they started to phase out the K98Ks essentially immediately after the Six-Day War, wanting to replace them with a more modern semi-automatic sniper rifle. That would take a couple of years to scale up, but ultimately they ended up adopting two different patterns of sniper semi-autos, one being the Galatz, which is the 308 version of the Galil scoped, and the other was the M14. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel received like 35,000 M14 rifles from the United States, and they built a bunch of those into sniper patterns as well. So those are beyond the scope of today's video, but some of the first of those snipers actually used repurposed and modified Wild Swiss scopes with the weird mounts turned off and set into regular rings. And some of the scopes from those later rifle procurements, like the Nimrods, were actually retrofitted back onto K98Ks for use by not the IDF, but local territorial defense sort of organizations in Israel who still liked their Mausers, but recognized that the newer scopes, like the Nimrods, were much, they had better optics, they were better scopes, they were much more effective overall. So that is why you will see mounts for these by then obsolete K98Ks made to mount the more modern scopes. And when you see these guns in the collector's market today, because many of them have now been surplused off, you'll see them actually more commonly with later scopes. The original Swiss Wild scopes are actually fairly rare to find these days. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I would like to give a big thanks to Meyer Antiques and MCT Defense for helping provide me a bunch of the information, some of the details on the origins and development of these rifles in IDF use. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.